Good afternoon, good afternoon. Happy Wednesday, how are you? Thank you so much for joining us on this terrific day to talk about preparing the next generation of BIPOC STEM leaders. I'm your host, Senegal Alfred Mabry, Senior Policy Analyst at the Hunt Institute. We want to thank you so much for joining us for today's conversation. We are so looking forward to hearing from our amazing resource experts, Mimi Fox-Melton, Chief Executive Officer of Code 420, Dr. Malik Henfield, Founding Dean of the Institute for Racial Justice at Loyola University of Chicago, Dr. Eve DeRosa, Associate Professor at Cornell University's College of Human Ecology, and also a Dean, and we'll be discussing more about that during today's conversation, and our moderator, Dr. Brian Garrett, Regional Program Director of East SMASH. Really want to give a huge shout out to all of our amazing panelists for today. And I also, my apologies, Code 2040, I think I slipped up right there. Mimi Fox-Melton, Chief Executive Officer of Code 2040. Really looking forward to an awesome discussion today. Thank you all for joining us. I want to also give a big shout out to the team behind the scenes who made this webinar happen. Thank you to Jen, to Julia, to Abigail, to Sophie, to John, to Michelle, all of the folks who work behind the scenes to make this amazing conversation happen today. We want to hear from you throughout today's conversation, and we also want to hear from you online with the hashtag race and education. Please use the hashtag race and education when tweeting about today's conversation. Please also use the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen to post your questions, post your comments. We want to hear your thoughts, your ideas, your engagement, because that's what makes this really an amazing race and education webinar. So again, thank you all so much. Really looking forward to a great conversation with our panelists on preparing the next generation of BIPOC STEM leaders, led by Mimi Fox-Melton, Chief Executive Officer at Code 2040. Dr. Malik Henfield, Founding Dean at the Institute for Racial Justice at Loyola University of Chicago, Dr. Eve DeRosa, Associate Professor at Cornell's University's College of Human Ecology, and Dr. Brian Garrett, Regional Program Director of East SMASH. Couple notes before we begin. If this is your first interaction with the Hunt Institute, we were created by four-term North Carolina Governor Jim Hunt to be an education policy resource center for state leaders trying to make more equitable decisions in education policy. Right now, our country is at an inflection point in terms of our economy, in terms of our learning, in terms of what our students are being prepared to do and to step into leadership roles in the future. The research is showing our children of color are less likely to enter these STEM professions, and when they enter the STEM professions, there's more likely to be higher turnover in job positions. So we need to disrupt that, we need to challenge that, and we need to recognize the systemic racism that's often in our economic system, in our education system, in our social system that's perpetuating these equity gaps that threaten to marginalize generations of young people. So I'm really excited for our Dr. Brian Garrett to begin the conversation and to get us started with challenging those narratives and those gaps. So, Dr. Garrett.
Thank you, Senegal. Good afternoon, everyone. I guess good morning to those who may be on the West Coast. Thank you all for joining us for this conversation. Thank you to the Hunt Institute again, and Dr. Siddiqui, I know you couldn't be here, but thank you all for putting together this really important webinar. So I'm Brian Garrett, Dr. Brian Garrett. I think we've all agreed, the panelists have all agreed, we're gonna go by a first name basis here. So we're gonna have a nice, friendly conversation, you know, stripping off the layers and the titles and really talking about the work and the conversation at hand. So the work I do is actually, the title is a little bit misleading. I'm the Regional Program Director for SMASH in the East region. And so we are a nonprofit organization focused on preparing the next generation of STEM leaders. So we do that by partnering with a number of universities around the country where we have a residential program, at least outside of the context of COVID, where students live on these college campuses. They're exposed to support networks and STEM professionals of color networks in order to build that social capital, as well as just being exposed to the possibilities that exist within STEM disciplines and careers. We support them throughout their high school years and even into their early years of college with alumni programming, as well as internships with tech companies who we've partnered with. And so we're really trying to really teach STEM and allow students to learn STEM through a social justice lens, which is really important, and also developing that sense of community and belonging with each other. That's a really important part of what we do, and especially in my work directly with SMASH at Morehouse. So I'm just glad to be here and to be among our panelists. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves. First, well, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves and tell us all a little bit more about their work, but also to respond to these two questions. So in your work, how have you seen America's education system unfairly exclude students of color from the STEM field? And how does their exclusion impact their future educational, social, and career outcomes and the scientific profession? So first up, Eve, I'll have you respond.
So, hi everyone. I'm really excited to be part of this panel. I am a neuroscientist, and so I study how the brain takes in information and learns about it and remembers it. And I study the chemistry of the brain in both rats and humans. And I am a professor at Cornell, and I'm the current Dean's Fellow for Racial and Social Justice. And so this is the lens that I take. We know from a very early age that picturing yourself as included in STEM, even at 3 years old, the stereotypes about women and people of color, Black people specifically, not being capable of being in STEM. It happens as early as 3 and 4 years old. And so one of the things that I've done, I was attracted to Cornell because they have a land grant mission, and a land grant mission to take your science out of the ivory tower into the world and impact people's lives in New York State. And so with that in mind, a few years ago, I created a program called Brain Days. And Brain Days, we are teaching elementary children from kindergarten to 4th grade about neuroscience, and we're making them neuroscientists at a very early age. And we are taking undergraduates from Cornell who look like them. So this is in Syracuse. It's an urban center. The schools, many of the schools, I think it's 70% of the children that we have the privilege of working with are under the poverty line. And so we want at a very early age for them to be able to picture university for themselves and STEM, so neuroscientists, and we're making them brain sciences. And our impulse is really because the brain is how we learn. It's the only organ that people don't talk about, and it's something that they own. So we're giving them ownership of their brains and being able to picture themselves in the STEM field. So that's important. And we have high school students that are integrated into this program as well, so that the elementary students are seeing their peers, their future selves, and then the high school students are seeing their future selves with our undergrads. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is I have, in my position as Dean's Fellow of Racial and Social Justice, I've done the other end of the spectrum, creating a cohort hire for scholars who are doing impactful work in social justice. And so it's not enough to get people to university. And I know Mimi is going to talk about sort of how people integrate into internships, and that I see that as a problem at the university. But it's also, once you get that degree and you now get a faculty position, the need to having structures that provide support and mentorship so that you get to stay in that world and your voice is a part of the university. And so we are bringing a cohort so that they're not alone, they'll have support. And they're doing impactful work in communities in a sustained way. And I think by having science go back out of the university into the world and impacting people's lives, again, gives examples of how to picture yourself potentially in that world.
That's beautiful. Thank you so much for sharing that. I'm taking notes, so I'm here to learn from everybody on the panel. So if you see me looking down, I'm learning. So thank you, Eve, for sharing that. Next, we're going to have Malik. Introduce yourself, please.
Thanks, Brian. Like you, I was sitting here taking notes as well. I'm looking at this as a beautiful conversation around like-minded individuals. So I'm very thankful for the opportunity to be here today. Malik Henfield, I'm currently the founding dean of a new Institute for Racial Justice set to launch this fall at Loyola University, Chicago. A couple of the notes that I took down already in listening to Eve were stereotypes and mission in higher education. And I wrote down stereotypes because as I think about the answer to the question around unfairly excluding students of color in STEM, I can't help but think about myself. I too am a STEM major. I graduated from little tiny Francis Marion University in Florence, South Carolina, with a biology degree after changing my major at least 5 times and kind of falling into it. And I wrote down the word stereotypes because I don't necessarily fit that. When you think about my background being raised in Brooklyn, New York, and the crack explosion in the 80s and so on and so forth, and all of the things that had to be overcome in order to get to this point where I am right now. So when I think about the issue, I think about it from the standpoint of those stereotypes of myself as an individual growing up in that environment, but also getting to higher ed and thinking about the mission of higher ed and the things that we're supposed to be doing in this environment. And I can't help but think about the fact that, I graduated with that degree in biology and didn't necessarily have the support in my experience to know what to do with it. So I kind of fell into a job. And then when the student loan corporations came calling, I had to figure out how to get into grad school to put off those loans for a little bit. So I fell into school counseling by accident, just because I had a homeboy who happened to be in school counseling at the University of South Carolina master's degree program. And in that experience, once I graduated and became a school counselor, I saw a number of kids who looked like me. And I saw that they didn't have a lot of support and direction. And I tried to do as much as I could as an individual, but it made me start thinking about the systems that were in place where I felt as though the onus was solely on me to make that difference, as opposed to the structures in which we resided in that moment. So then I ventured off and went to Ohio State to get the degree in counselor education, simply because the person that I knew, the only Black person I knew who was a Black male faculty member in a PhD program, taught me at the University of South Carolina, and then went on to Ohio State. So I followed him there as well. And he's now actually James Elmore III, the VP for Vice Provost for Diversity there at Ohio State. And it was that experience that helped me start thinking about structures more intently. And so when I left there, I saw my experiences at other institutions, including the one where I am right now, quite frankly, through that lens, thinking about the structures that aren't necessarily in place to recruit individuals who care about these issues, who research these issues, like Eve, who just spoke before me, but also, and I would argue more importantly, to retain them. We have a lot of work to go in that direction. I don't necessarily think that we're spending, and I say we, I mean higher ed as a whole, spending as much of our time focusing on retention as much as recruitment. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later on, as the work that I'm currently involved in speaks to that, as well as a lot of other issues in relation to STEM in the pipeline.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing. So many thoughts. I'm gonna keep us on track here. So our final panelist introduction is gonna come from Mimi. Please share with us.
Hi, everyone. Glad to be here. I'm Mimi Fox Melton, and I'm the CEO at Code 2040. Code 2040 is a national nonprofit that is based in the Bay Area. And our focus is on activating, connecting, and mobilizing the largest racial equity community in tech, centering the Black and Latinx experience. So we use direct service programs to address systemic barriers to recruiting, retention, and advancement for Black and Latinx people in tech companies. And so the question that Brian proposed for us is a little bit differently, because we aren't focused on how education discriminates against Black and other people of color, rather how racialized capitalism and white-centered work cultures and systems limit the ability for Black and Latinx people to join companies, grow in our roles, and really to contribute to, in the fullness of our wisdom and brilliance. And I came to this work through my own journey for mental and spiritual health, and really coming to understand that my own liberation and the liberation of other Black people is unfortunately tied up in the liberation of everyone else, including white folks who have, the power and control in most of our capitalist systems. And so the work that we do is both focused on helping Black and Latinx people get in and advance in tech, but really helping tech companies see the places where it is their own choices and systems and policies and procedures that are the problem, and shifting the impetus for change and growth and expansion from us to those with all of the resources and power and actually the ability to change, to make change. So I think we'll talk a little bit more about that. I'll just leave it there for now.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you to all of our panelists for sharing a little bit more about you and your work. And I will highlight, since we do have a little bit of wiggle room here in time, that so many different thoughts and things, and I'll make sure I'll be brief and move us along here, but we talked a lot about retention, and as part of my own experience, my training is in chemistry and biochemistry, and I worked in a startup for a short stint and in biotech in the Bay Area, and now I'm in this work, right? And so I also think about my own experience, and if there were different systems in place at these organizations, these institutions, and even these entire ecosystems, might I have continued in that type of work? So it makes me reflect on my own experience, but that's also something that I'm grateful that I'm able to bring that experience to the young people who I work with as well, in order to kind of peel back the curtain and give them a little bit of insight into what they could experience and how to navigate that. So I'm already excited about this. All right, let's keep going. So one of the first questions I have for the panelists, this is for Mimi. So what is the problem with the narrative on the STEM pipeline and a lack of scientists of color in the STEM professions in education?
So I wanna, before I answer that question, I'll say that, like, statistically, right, like, there's no arguing with the data that we have work to do to help Black and other POC young people see themselves as scientists and technologists, and to have the tools and access to the same resources that non-Black and POC folks have, that help them see themselves as scientists and technologists and have access to the pathways that lead us into those careers. However, in our work, there's a very popular narrative within the tech industry that called the pipeline narrative. We call it the pipeline myth. This is the Bedfellow of Meritocracy. And what that means is essentially when companies are either called to task on their lack of diversity and their lack of racial equity, or come to, bring themselves to the discussion, the most popular excuse for lack of racial equity in companies is that there's no pipeline. So there aren't, essentially, Black and brown people in tech don't exist. And the tie to meritocracy is another way of absolving companies of any sort of responsibility for the lack of diversity in tech, where they say, tech is a meritocracy. If you know how to, if you know engineering, if you know computer science, and you're good at it, you'll get in, which is fundamentally racist, right? And completely ignores systemic barriers to entry and retention that are rampant. And so the problem is really centered in the fact that there are multiple reasons, systemic reasons that go back 500 years in this country for why there are more white people in tech than there are non-white folks. But the pipeline narrative centers only on one, and it places the blame on us, on Black and brown people, for as we are the cause. Our lack of intelligence or education is the reason that we're not making it into tech. And so our work at Code 2040 is we essentially don't engage the pipeline conversation at all. Like, we reject it as, and there are plenty of people doing really good work on it, and like, love y'all, not at all disparaging that work, but removing it from the conversation helps us focus the spotlight on tech companies and white people in power in tech companies who, where the power is centered to change the systems that they actually have control of. So the one thing they want to focus on is the thing that they basically can't do anything about. But the things that they do have impact in are the things they want to ignore. And I'll share a brief story. I know that other panelists have experience in this. So we work with a company that shall remain unnamed that is working with us on a program to hire 10 Black or Latinx computer science majors for an internship program this summer. And 80% of the companies that are working with us for the first time in that program struggle to hire for the summer. And almost 100% of that 80 say, oh, the folks that you have in your cohort for us to hire just like aren't meeting the bar. They're not skilled, you know, and so we're like, okay, cool. We have 8,000 data points that we've collected along the way. Let us look at these to see wherein lies the problem. And in this instance, we did that. We did some interviews. Our team did some digging. And what we found was that when the recruiting team was sending candidates from our program to the engineers to interview them, to make the call on like whose team they would sit on, who would hire them, the engineers had essentially blacklisted any interviews from racial equity organizations. So they had just said, we are not returning emails, we're not talking to folks, but nobody knew that. So the recruiters kept getting messages that were like, they don't want any of the candidates, and assumed that that was because the candidates were unskilled. And so we were able to go back to the company and say, actually, no one in your engineering department has talked to a single one of the candidates. There's been no technical assessment done whatsoever. And so, in fact, there's no way for you to know that they're unskilled. And once the C-level team at the org was involved, they hired 10 out of 10 positions within a matter of weeks. And so that's the sort of thing that we help companies see. That's like, let's assume that Black people aren't the problem just for a minute and use our imaginations to figure out what else could possibly be the problem and try to address those things first.
Yeah, thank you. Eve, I know you have a perspective on this as well. I want you to share that and maybe also respond to this question. So what are some of the investments, and this is related to your work, but what are some of the investments you have made at Cornell in growing the number of STEM leaders of color, both at the K through 12 level and in improving the diversity of faculty?
So I'll first refer to what Mimi was speaking about from a student's point of view. So we have we have actually a lot of female electrical engineers in the lab, but one of them is an undergraduate, a Black woman. And she described to me her experience, and the reason I guess I was inspired by what Mimi was saying is it's that moving hoop to jump through. You jump through this one, and then they have another one in terms of meritocracy. And so for her, she came from a place where she was not expected to be at Cornell, and she got through all the hoops to get to Cornell. Freshman year, she's an electrical engineering student. She's excited to be there, wants to join the freshman engineering teams, and she's disadvantaged because she didn't have all of this internship sort of experience. So she is already at disadvantage in her first year, can't get into labs, can't get onto projects because she doesn't have the internship experience, and her parents wouldn't have had the money for her to be able to do that. And so and I know she's not alone, but I just wanted to share that even once you defy all the structures and you get there to these places, then there are other ways that they've changed the rules in another way that you can't meet. And so that's something that I think we still have to actively work on once we have our BIPOC students at the universities. And then in terms of diversifying the faculty, so the initiative that I described, Pathways to Social Justice, this is one of the costs of being a faculty of color at a predominantly white institution is there's a lot of unseen taxes. We are asked to mentor in a way that's invisible. It's just things that we have to be in front of a classroom and defy all the stereotypes. There's just a multitude of taxes. And a lot of times you're a one of, or maybe a two of if you're lucky. And so the idea of the cohort, and we're hiring at a college level, bringing people of color in together so that they're not a one of. So inside of their department, they might be a one of, but they have a home, they have support structures outside of the department, and they have like-minded scholars to collaborate with. So the idea is that with that and with building structures to then mentor the cohort to make sure that they get to stay, then that's the idea that you are building, you're diversifying and building and supporting BIPOC scholars. And we have a yield problem a lot of times for predominantly white institutions in terms of there's only a certain number of Black and brown scholars that are being accepted into university. And so by having faculty that look like them might make it also more inviting to come and stay at some of these sort of predominantly white institutions. No, I'll leave it there.
Yeah, no, thank you for sharing. And something theme I feel I heard from you and Mimi is that if you don't get to the structural flaws, you will always see BIPOC students and professionals as the problem, right? And so that's a nice little gem I'm taking away from this. And Malik, so two-part question. Can you share some of the findings from your research on gifted and talented programs? And what are some of the policies that are excluding children of color from receiving access to these instructional resources?
Absolutely, but first I just want to echo your sentiments and what you gleaned from the conversation thus far. Yes, I totally agree. Structures. Whenever we're able to be in person again, I would love to invite you, Brian, to my house because my wife is actually over DEI for a pretty large tech organization, and we have lots of dialogue about the exact same things we're talking about on this call right now. And it's really useful for me because it helps me understand a lot of what we're talking about in higher education. And it's by nature very abstract because we're not in the workforce. So I'm comparing and contrasting her experience and the dialogue we're having around this pipeline issue. And it makes for a lively conversation over dinner each night. But in terms of my research, so as you mentioned, I focus a lot of my energy on gifted and talented students, in large part because, quite frankly, I think that we need to blow up this whole notion of gifted and talentedness, so to speak. So I'm constantly thinking, again, bringing it back from myself and my personal experience. That's what drives me and my passion around this work. I never was identified for anyone's gifted and talented program. In fact, I was thought of as someone who couldn't work, even be in college for that matter. And I was assigned courses aligned with that thought of where my future would take me. So a lot of my work has been spent on trying to understand those individuals, those Black and Latinx students in particular, who managed to defy the odds and who have grown up in environments similar to my own and managed to find success. And a lot of what I've heard a lot about is the impact of having someone who can serve as a vetting agent, so to speak. So you have school counselors. Again, my background profession is in school counseling. So you have school counselors who are oftentimes under-resourced and under pressure from a lot of parents who are in the know, so to speak, and pull on them for attention and ways to get their kids into opportunity hoarding. You have school counselors who are beholden to families who understand all of the hoops, as was mentioned earlier, that students need to jump through in order to get their kids into their preferred universities. And oftentimes those kids who just don't know, don't have access to that valuable resource in schools. So in terms of a policy change that could be made, I would argue that we need to require school counselors in schools, just like we require social workers across the country, because there's no one, and again, I'm biased, obviously, but I would contend that there's no one in the K-12 environment who's better prepared to support our Black and brown students who may have the potential to do well in STEM, but don't necessarily have the know-how or the support, emotional and mental support, in order to survive the gauntlet, the hoops that it would require, the artificial hoops, I'll say as well, in a lot of ways, that are put up in order for students to find success in these areas. And I'm also thinking about an experience I had yesterday to even bring it back to higher ed, because through the Institute, we'll also be focusing on the pipeline in relation to higher ed environments. I'm thinking about a conversation I had with someone who's not necessarily related to STEM, but it still applies. They're in business. And they were talking to me around pipelines into supply chain with the statement of, we just can't find any Black or Latinx talent. And I'm thinking about reaching out to some folks who just so happen to be Black and Latinx. And they were asking me, would that individual find that offensive? And the question that I had to them is, how do they normally go to the steps that they go through to find talent? And they responded with, I usually work with my cohort, with my colleagues that I already know. And I asked him what those people's races are. And he said they're, quite honestly, mostly, if not all, white. It's like, okay, so why does race not matter in those instances? But it matters when you're talking about reaching out to Black and Latinx talent. So it was a great eye-opening experience for this individual. And I felt good in that moment, because it gave me hope, honestly, that some of the changes that we need to make at the individual level in particular are pretty small relative to some of the larger structures that we have in place that need to be knocked down. But if you can help some folks, white folks, understand some of the power that they have and ways that they can leverage it in response to the crisis that we have at hand, and the role that they're playing in creating this crisis, I think that there's ways that we can use those individuals to enact policies and practices that can counteract some of the structural barriers that are in place.
Yeah. Thank you.
Do you mind if I jump in there, Brian?
Yeah, please.
Malik, I was super resonating with what you shared about white folks feeling like they don't want to offend, like if we actually had this problem back in 2015 when like killings of Black folks by police were just really being shared on social media. And a lot of the companies that we partnered with, we had to actually like create a session for white folks to coach them on basically what was happening was Black and Latinx people were going to work after, you know, grieving the murder of someone in our broader racial community. And no one was talking about it. They were the only person that like was like shook at work, you know? And a lot of the feedback from white folks was, what do I do? Do I go up to the only Black person in the office and say, I'm sorry that Black people, like that police murdered a Black person this week? And so anyway, I recently wrote an article about this, really centering in fear of conflict and how much fear of conflict that is like a tenet of white supremacy and really deeply rooted in white culture limits the ability for white people to be uncomfortable, to be willing to be in conversations that stretch them. And, you know, I think like people of color, white immigrants, you can't grow up in this world, in this country, and not be uncomfortable all the time. And so, but that's not the experience for white folks. And so some of the work that we've been doing is creating this long-term training that calls white people into increasing their resilience around the experience of being uncomfortable in conversations, and that white comfort doesn't need to be a priority when we are addressing some of these systems that are super entrenched and like really painful for us. So I just wanted to like signal boost that, and like, let's normalize white people being uncomfortable at work. They too can be uncomfortable at work, because that's what it's going to take to change these systems, right? Yeah. I'll stop my soapbox.
Oh, thank you for sharing. I appreciate all the panelists for being candid and sharing your thoughts and views and work. So we have several questions in the Q&A tool here, and I've been sifting through trying to find ones that I think are most broadly applicable to the panel and would be helpful for this conversation. But there are some really good ones here. I guess one, kind of coming back to institutions, actually. There was a question in here about, to what extent, this is from Tracy Johnson, to what extent does the panel feel like higher education institutions serve as gatekeepers of the STEM field, and how can these institutions remove these self-created barriers? They said, for example, requiring calculus in high school to enroll in an engineering major. So maybe one or two panelists in, say, 1 or 2 minutes, so we can try to get to a few of these questions.
I got a lot to say, but please, Eve, you're in higher.
I was going to say, actually, Malika, you go first. I'll go second. Go ahead.
Yes, we contribute. We may not want to admit that we contribute, but the data suggests otherwise. And there's a laundry list of evidence to not only suggest, but assert our contributions to these efforts. You mentioned some of the requirements for entry to higher ed. Now, all of a sudden, folks are going test optional, which would suggest that this wasn't something that was required from day one. I'm thinking about through the Institute for Racial Justice, again, that I'm building right now, we're thinking about ways that we might be able to support we're doing a search for a chief diversity officer for Loyola University Chicago. So anyone interested, I'm sharing the search, hit me up. I'd love to have a strong partner, because the Institute for Racial Justice will be developing a lab that this individual can leverage. And the hope is that we'll be able to dig deeply into some of the barriers that, again, that we ourselves have put into place. as a way to counteract them and tear them down, quite frankly. So one of the things, for example, I'm thinking about as a project is a large scale network analysis to try to look at some of the students that we have, particularly our students of color, and see exactly what are the opportunities that they're being provided versus some of our white students. I'm thinking about it in terms of disaggregating mentoring and sponsorship. It's a very clear distinction between the two. We have tons of faculty who will serve as a mentor and offer all of the advice that you ever want to need, that you would ever need. But when it comes to sponsorship, like I'm going to put you on this grant, I'm going to show you how to write your own grant. I'm going to put you on this paper. I'm going to show you how to write your own papers. I'm going to hook you up with folks who can potentially hire you post-graduation. Oftentimes it's our students of color who don't get that level of support. And there's no data that we're collecting as an institution, and I would argue any other institution around the country that gets at those sorts of things. So I'm looking at the Institute for Racial Justice to, for example, look at, start small. So look at some of our STEM areas and start with a smaller project around this sort of thing, see what the data provides, put it out there in a way that folks will have to answer for it and hold themselves accountable for developing ways to, again, counteract these structures and barriers that we put up ourselves. We are the creators of our own problems, quite frankly, no matter what people will say to you. We've done this as institutions by either directly enacting these barriers or turning a blind eye despite what the data states very clearly. And one thing that I can say, I'm at a predominantly white institution, but one thing I can say is that we are having a day of reckoning at our place at my place of employment. We're doing, for example, a racial justice examen where we're asking each and every school to ask themselves, each and every unit in the schools, in the university, to ask themselves these hard questions. Why does your data look the way that it looks? And we have some, quite frankly, who are engaging in the process in a way that we should be proud of. And we have some, quite frankly, who are making excuses. But at the end of the day, that should be expected. You will always have resistance. And because white supremacy is something that each of us, even people of color, can internalize, it ain't just the white folks who are throwing up some of these barriers. But my hope is in the long term, we can identify exactly where we want to go, because we're going as an institution through the strategic planning process right now. We can determine where we want to go and really set up strict, clear, measurable KPIs and understand who's responsible for meeting these KPIs and move forward in a way that we can all be proud of and get us in the right direction in the ways that students deserve, especially given the tuition that we're charging at a private institution. But I'll stop there. I could go on. Forgive me for taking too long. I get heated about this stuff. Eve.
Oh, it's fine. Eve?
I'm just going to say amen to sponsorship. I think that's the critical ingredient. And I'm going to pass it over to Mimi.
Wow, Eve, that was so short. Good. Okay. Stop hazing Black students, white students, doesn't matter, right? These institutions that have a requirement that second year CS only has 100 people, and so we have to haze out 300 folks. That's abusive. Stop hazing Black PhD candidates. Also, love y'all institutions, but a couple of years ago at Code 2040, I reached out to colleges because I thought this was the way, working with CS departments. And I was told that we had to pay $400,000 a year to partner with CS departments as a nonprofit. And so we were like, cool, we're gonna invite Black and brown people to Starbucks and spend $20 buying them coffees. And we organized all of our programs that way, but it has meant that we haven't been able to help institutions address systemic challenges because of that sort of financial gatekeeping. And stop asking the one Black person on staff to fix all of the institutionalized racist problems in addition to their full-time job. This needs to be an institute. This needs to be a team. This needs to have a budget. Okay, that was more than a minute, but.
No, thank you. Thank all of you. And so there's another question that it's in alignment with this, but we've spoken about the invisible text, and maybe you started kind of getting into it, talking about the hazing, all right, speaking to the hazing of students. But we've spoken about the invisible text, people of color are paying at school and work. How do we make those taxes visible so policymakers and administrators can remove them? And that's open. Maybe Eve, if you want to share, like you gave a brief response a moment ago.
I guess from my point of view, bringing faculty onto our campus is the thing I guess I should share with people that I was just elected Dean of Faculty at Cornell. It's the first woman, first person of color. So it's a big deal. And one of the things that I would want to do is to, at a systemic level, to talk about what excellence is, because it, and again, can be a moving target and used against people of color. And so the idea of getting in writing what the rules are for promotion and tenure and development, and getting those things done in writing so that everyone has guideposts. And I think the thing that we all have talked about is like those structures that are put in front of us, that they can move based on whatever, once we achieve that one, then the next one comes up. And so that's the thing to address, to get something that is concrete that we can respond to and achieve. And then we can point to the fact that we achieved it and it can't move. So that, for me, that's a critical part of what needs to be solved on a systemic level.
I would say that like mental health support for Black and Brown students is so critical. Half of our programs every year are actually providing social work and counseling to especially Black people who have been essentially systematically abused within institutions. And specifically, I'm talking about institutions like Stanford. I've seen people who are like walking shells of human beings because of the experiences that they've had at these places. And those are the successful ones. Those are the ones that have graduated with a degree and have a high paying job, but essentially can barely function because of just the terrible experience that they've been through. And I really think it's public-private, or however you want to private partnerships. Again, like we had to bring on, our work is about helping, in this program is about helping Black and Latinx folks get internships. And we bring on social workers over the summer because the majority of what we see is when Black and Brown people get into a room together and realize that they're actually not the problem and that everyone else is experiencing this as well. It opens up this level of trauma processing that like our staff actually cannot handle because we're not trained. And so grief counselors, I mean, you name it, this, and I'm like, why aren't universities supporting with this? We are taking on the bulk of this responsibility because it's not happening on campus. And folks need more support.
Yes, quick that I wrote down: trauma, tax, and incentives and carrots. So the trauma point that's real, and again, we have no one to blame but ourselves. And I feel like we want to hold one another, we being faculty, I've got my faculty hat on right now, not the administrator hat. We want to say that we're about social justice and so on and so forth. And we write these articles talking about what other organizations and other professions and practitioners should be doing, whereas we have chaos right in our own backyards. We have students, like Mimi just said, who are walking around like shells of themselves. So one thing that we can do as faculty is come together and say that, you know what, we're going to create policies to police ourselves. We don't need you, administrator, to come down and lay the smack down. We can do this on our own. What that looks like, I'm not exactly sure, but my hope is that folks can get together and figure that out, because I'm so tired of fingers being pointed when the power, and quite honestly, in a lot of ways, rests with the faculty. And in terms of this tax, that also is very real. I remember being at the University of Iowa and having students sneak to my office who weren't necessarily my advisees, but they knew if their advisor knew that they were talking to me, they'd have hell to pay. That should not be. That is unacceptable. It makes absolutely no sense. And again, there are other faculty who know that this sort of thing is going on, and oftentimes we turn a blind eye. So we have to figure out ways to incentivize better behavior, the things that we want to see, and that can be done if we have the conversation with administration and faculty at the table.
I'm just getting life right now. This is, y'all are speaking to my experiences and my trauma. It's amazing to hear you all and to be validated in many ways, and what I've experienced and a lot of my colleagues and friends have experienced. So, all right, I'm trying to manage the clock, the chat, the questions, I'm trying to manage it all. I think
you're doing great.
Thank you. I appreciate it. I appreciate it. I think what we'll do is we'll close with this. I'm going to ask the panel to respond maybe in two or so minutes each to the following question. And there are so many more questions and so many more things that we could be discussing. I mean, I hope there's a part two. I really do. I'm just going to put it out there. It's going to go out. Maybe we can make that happen. Final question for the panelists. What is one change you hope to see or that you will be advocating for in the next 4 years that might help end the exclusion of young people of color in our professions, in STEM professions? Whoever wants to respond first, we'll have everyone respond. And I'll repeat it one more time. Maybe I'll muff that one a little bit. So, what is one change you hope to see or that you will be advocating for in the next 4 years that might help end the exclusion of young people of color in our STEM professions?
I'll go first. So that article that I shared with you all was kind of like a tester that we're doing on sharing really, really, really simple to understand, I hope, fingers crossed, non-jargony, practical solutions that folks in the workplace can use to disrupt anti-Blackness, see the places where they've either internalized anti-Blackness or internalized white supremacy in practical and operationalizable ways, and suggestions on how they can do differently. And so my hope is that Code 2040 is going to be able to, in the next year, build out a resource hub where folks can come and receive non-shame-based coaching virtually on these types of things, so that, when they hire their first Black woman, the first day of orientation, no one's touching her hair or talking about her hair, right? Simple, actionable. That's open source and easy to access. Yeah, that's say prayers for us, y'all. We're undertaking the design of that this year.
I'll pop in to say, I want to remove the stigmatism and pressure on our Black and brown students. It's not for them to own the burden. And so we have to alleviate that burden for them. And at this moment, I don't know what that looks like, but that is my desire. And that's something I'll be working for. It's not them, it's the system.
Echo that. One thing, building an institute, I need to get this off the ground. This is my job, y'all. This thing got to work, right? But one thing that I'm certainly, one thing I know that will ensure, I would say, success is developing strong partnerships with folks like all of you on this panel who really are passionate about this work. The things that we're trying to focus on is centering race and racial justice in our research, education, and community engagement. So Eve, I can imagine, for example, partnering with you and some of your postdocs around research ideas that community organizations in Chicago and surrounding areas can actually put to good use. Mimi, I mentioned earlier, I came out to Chicago from the Bay Area. I still have a strong partnership with the mayor's office in San Francisco. So I'm designing study the US courses and taking students out to the Bay Area. I would love to drop in and see what's up, see what's going on, and see how we can partner. And I promise you not to try and charge you any six-figure fee. I don't even know what that is about. I'd have so many questions around that. And also, Brian, I remember I used to live in Oakland and we used to hang out downtown, and I strolled into the Kapoor Center and learned about this Smash Institute thing that they had going on. And I went to one of the sessions, and now I'm working with the individual who is responsible for Smash Illinois right here in Chicago. We're trying to figure out how to partner. So those are just examples of real world ways I'm trying to forge authentic relationships with people to break down this idea of the ivory tower coming into it with all of the answers, because quite frankly, we're experts on the research, but it's folks like you, Brian, and you, Mimi, who are on the ground actually doing the work, and you're the experts on the practice. So my goal with the Institute for Racial Justice is to marry the two, all for the benefit of Black and brown folks in Chicago, the nation, and the world.
I want to also pop in to say that, you know, one of the things that we're doing in our college, and we're trying to get this university-wide, is to get researchers to build relationships with communities, and not to study them, but to have impact in a beneficial way and in a sustained way. And so a critical part of that is leaving that ivory tower and being used, have the community be able to use us as a resource. And I think that's, I think the future of universities, I think is going to be a really big part of the future of universities.
This is like a healing circle, or like this feels great. This is a much needed moment for me. And I just want to thank our panelists, audience. We can't see you. Hopefully you're clapping or snapping somewhere. We send those vibes to our panelists, to Mimi, Malik, Eve. Thank you all for sharing so much of your wisdom and insights and your work and expertise. I saw some other folks here in the Q&A say yes to a part 2. So, you know, I think I'm going to try to get some signatures going or some sort of petition. So everyone look out for a link at the conclusion of this webinar. But really, thank you all. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you to the audience members who've come. Thank you to the Hunt Institute for putting this together. I know that Senegal has already shared what's coming up next. And so I'm going to pass the mic to Senegal here to close us out with some final resources.
I just want to take a moment to thank you first, Dr. Garrett, for beautiful moderation of a wonderful panel. Thank you to you, Mimi, to you, Eve, to you, Malik, for a real truth telling about the challenges that our students, our professionals, our community is facing in the context of this STEM profession, and reflecting as the son of a woman who has a master's in physics and math and was told she would never be an astronaut. The onus is on our K-12 system, our higher education system, and also our policymakers to really step up and solve these challenges so that we are not marginalizing a generation of young people who have the skills, the knowledge, and the opportunity to transform the world in our STEM professions. So I want to thank you all, and I want to direct you to the next Hunt Institute webinar, which is going to be our conversation on transcending party lines, collaboration, and education with the Honorable Governor Chris Christie and David Axelrod. We also have another upcoming conversation in our Race and Education series on Latinx identity on college campuses, really zeroing in on the challenges our Latinx students are facing and recognizing that they are not a monolith, that their challenges are different based on their identities, their experiences, and I'm sure it's going to have a lot of connection to this STEM platform. So thank you all again for an amazing conversation. I'm looking forward to talking about part 2.